So you probably have heard of the term homeostasis, specifically as it applies to our biology. So this technically means the same state. So homeo means same, and stasis would mean state, right? So we can actually talk about homeostasis in other systems. And so homeostasis is the ability to maintain a set point. So maybe maintain a relatively a constant set point. So when we look at these systems, we can look at whether or not we can move that set point. So in us, it would be like maybe heart rate, or it would be body temperature, or it would be what else? Glucose levels in our blood. But what about if in another system like the hydrological system or like an ecosystem, what if this means, say, for example, the amount of forest cover, so the amount of canopy, the amount of precipitation, maybe even the temperature, the air temperature in an ecosystem. So we have some diagrams that we can look at that explain very nicely this idea of maintaining a relatively constant set point. So this is an example that shows what would happen if you had this kind of system where there was nothing to prevent the set point from changing. So let's say that there is a disturbance, say that there is a fire in your ecosystem, and there is relatively no homeostasis. And so this set point is going to just shoot this ball, and it's not going to come back to the set point. There's no way for it to come back. There's no mechanism in place which would allow it to come back to its set point. In this example, we see that we have this resistance to change. And this could be a mechanism, right? So when we have a fire, right, it could cause a depletion of the plants, but we have a mechanism by which plants can regenerate themselves after a fire, and we can have ecological succession. So we can have new plants emerging and then changes in that community over time that would bring it back to the set point. And so this would be an example of a stable system, and this would be an example of an unstable system. So this one is exhibiting homeostasis, and this one would not. So we are pretty dependent upon having stability in our systems. We're pretty dependent because we want to know, for example, how much rainfall there's going to be in a given month, because that might determine when we plant our crops. So having this stability in our system is important from the perspective of a society, but it's also important from a perspective of evolution. So if we have very unstable environments, then it's quite possible that it could cause a dramatic die-off of species. So what we want to see is that if the set point does change, it needs to change relatively slowly so that natural selection can keep the plants and the animals moving in the right direction so that they are able to survive and to reproduce in that environment. So let's look at some other terms that are sometimes used in relationship to homeostasis. So we can talk about a resistant system. So a resistant system right here, notice that the edges are steeper. So it takes a greater disturbance to create a disturbance that would create the set point to move, but it does tend to come back to the set point. But so a resistant system is resistant to changes. So we could talk about, say, for example, grasslands maybe being resistant to changes. So even periodic fires, in a grassland system, the plants can replenish themselves, they can rejuvenate quite quickly, and the community or the ecosystem would go back. So it would be resistant. We can also talk about ones that are resilient. So resilient systems have a wide bowl. So this is the resilient system has this wideness. So even if we disturb it a lot, like if we burn it all down, it will come back. And I think grasslands are pretty resilient in that case. An example of a ecosystem that doesn't tend to have this type of resilience is deserts. So deserts, it takes it's very easy to, for example, cause erosion in a desert just simply by walking over the land, because there are these crusts that form on the desert, and those take a very long time to form, hundreds of years for these crusts to form on the desert floor, and that keeps the water from eroding. So oftentimes when we get disturbance, like maybe people driving their all-wheel vehicles through the desert and like tearing it up, it's not going to go back. It's going to take a long time for it to go back. So it's not going to be an easy thing to do to get that to come back. And so that would be kind of relating these ideas of homeostasis to ecosystem and ecosystem stability, not just the stability within an organism. And we could even talk about this in our social and economics situations, right? So do we have a social system that is resilient? So that means that we could have a disturbance like COVID, right? And this disturbance can, maybe we can have extreme, right, pandemic, but it will go back to the set point. I don't know if that's the case or not. So this is interesting to think about it in terms of different types of systems, not just the systems that are in our body.